Let's talk about parameter binding now. What is parameter binding? It's a way in which you can bind specific values to parameters in your SQL query. Now we have this example, we did this earlier. We did a from user details where the ID greater than 5. So my intention is to pull up all the user records whose ID is greater than the value 5. And just to recap, the code that's happening here is I'm just pulling up the list of all the users as per the query here, and then I'm printing out the username for all those users. Okay, so now in a scenario like this, where I say user ID is greater than a particular value, normally what would happen is this value would not be hard-coded. This would probably be a value from a different variable, and I would have to append the variable over here. So what would happen is normally I would have a int min user ID, say this would have been set as value 5 somewhere else in the application, and then I'm getting this variable. Now I would have to create a query where I need to pull up all the user details where the ID is greater than the value of this variable. So what I would do here is I would say plus min user ID. This will work fine. Now if I run this, it will pull up the list of users after the 5th user, and you can see here the query is also getting updated with this. But this is actually a potential security problem. Now this leads to what is called as SQL query injection, or sometimes it's just called a SQL injection. Now what this means is that you can inject some values into the query and you can get results which is not the intended results. Now an attacker, a hacker of your application can use this kind of a way of adding values to the query to manipulate their user inputs so that you get data which is not really intended. Now let's take for example this min user ID, which we have set the value of 5 here. Let's say this came from user input. Now the user entered the value of 5, and now we are passing this on and you are generating the results and you're displaying it. So now let's say the attacker is going to try a few things to see if he or she can break into the system somehow. So one thing that the attacker might try is something like this. Now let's say I realize that there is a chance that the application might be doing like it's just adding the parameter to the query. So what I do is I enter a particular value in my user input. Now let's say I enter something like this. Okay, first let me make this as a string. Most of the UI frameworks, at least on web applications, most of the UI frameworks have user inputs being received as strings. So it's very easy to do SQL injection on strings. I'm not able to recollect if you can do this with an integer data type, but with strings, yes, it's fairly easy if you're writing queries like this to do SQL injection. Now let's say I have a string input where the user is actually entering the value, and say the user can enter a value from 1 to 10, and then I'm substituting the value here. Now let's say the user enters a value like this. Let's say it's 5 or 1 equals 1. So now what I'm doing here is I am closing this where clause. Now the where is over here, where user ID is greater than. Now I'm closing this where clause by entering a value, and then I'm also adding an OR, and then I'm giving a expression that's always going to be true. So no matter whatever is the result of this first where clause, the second where clause is always going to be true, so it's going to return me all the records in the table. So now let's run this, see what happens. And here you see all the records have been pulled up. So this is the way in which a SQL injection can happen. Now this is not really an ideal example because we have a user ID greater than. Now the user can enter a user ID of min user ID of 0 and still manage to get all the records. But I hope you're getting the point here. The point here is that irrespective of what where clause you are actually having here, the user can bypass the where clause and inject their own where clause and do anything they want with it. They could as well have a semicolon here so that they end the query and then write a whole new query, be it a delete from table, so that they can delete all the records in the table. So there's a lot of havoc that a user can cause if we are doing SQL addition instead of something else that we're going to talk about. If we just do concatenation, then we are at risk of such kind of attacks. So the solution for this problem is to do parameter substitution. So that's what we're going to look at, and we're going to look at how Hibernate helps us to do this parameter substitution, or parameter binding as it's called. So let's take this example itself. Now I'll have string min user ID as 5, say. Okay, so this is the input that I've got from the user. Now what I'll do is, instead of adding that value to this string here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this is actually a parameter and it cannot be a snippet of the query. Now let me just write this here so that it becomes clear. Now what I'll do here is I will have a parameter in this query. Say something like this. Now this question mark is a placeholder for where the parameter needs to go. So I'm telling Hibernate that I have one parameter here, and this parameter needs to be substituted with the value that I'm going to supply now. So now that I have put a placeholder there, I need to supply this value to Hibernate. The way I'm going to supply the value is by using query.set. Now in this query.set, you have a few data types you can see here. You have a set binary, you have a set boolean, you have set character, set date. So all these are indicative of the data type that you want to add over here. Now in my case, the data type is an int, so I will set integer. Now the set integer takes two parameters. I'll set the first parameter as 0, and I will explain why in a minute. Now the second parameter has to be the integer value that I want to substitute. So since I have a string, I will use the integer.parseInt, and I will pass the value min user ID. So what I'm doing is I'm substituting the value of this parameter into the query at a placeholder. Now this works fine for string placeholders as well. Now if this were a string comparison, say I had a like operator or something like that, then I would use a query.set string, and the same thing would work. Now let's save and try to run this. We'll see what happens. So there you go, it's actually pulling up the data, fine. Now we'll look at what the 0 means. The 0 is a position indicator. Now I could have multiple parameters here, and in order to set parameter values, I need to specify which placeholder will be substituted with which parameter. Now let's have a look at, let's modify this query a bit. Let's say where user ID greater than question mark and username equals, and I will give a username value here. So let me declare another string. User10. So I will need to substitute the value of this input username over here. Of course, in this particular scenario, these two are redundant, but just go with me here. Now this parameter substitution is also done by using a question mark. Now how will you know what needs to be substituted with what? At least how will Hibernate know what needs to be substituted with what? And that's the reason why we have this position indicator. 0 is the first question mark. So it starts looking from the left and it sees the first question mark, that's 0. And now the second question mark is 1. So if I need to set this, the first parameter here has to be 1, and then the second parameter has to be the value, of course. So what I'll do here is I'll again do a query dot set. This time I'll do a string. So again, it takes two parameters. Now I'll pass this time I'm going to pass the first parameter as 1 because I want this question mark to be substituted with this value. And then the second parameter is, of course, the value that needs to be substituted. This will be username, which is this one. So now if I run this, there you go, user 10 comes up. Actually, that's the only one that should come up because with username as a more restrictive criteria. You can try out the SQL injection example that I told you earlier. It will not work on this scenario where you're actually plugging in the parameters, because you're saying I'm going to plug in a parameter and then you put a where clause in it. Hibernate detects this and says, hey, something is going wrong, and then it will not run the query. Okay, so this is one way we can do this. There is another way. If you don't want to be bothered about the positions and you want to just write the query and then substitute parameters directly, there is another way you can do this, and the way to do that is by using this colon and the parameter name. So what you can do is, instead of putting random placeholders which do not have any significant meaning and you're attaching meaning to it depending on the position of the placeholders, instead this way you attach a name to the placeholder and then you substitute the parameters to the name. So I'm going to put another placeholder here called username. So the way I put a named placeholder is by using a colon and giving it a name. So now that I have two named placeholders here, I can set these two parameters to the names without having to worry about where the placeholders actually are and without having to worry about the position of those placeholders. So now if you look at this query.setInteger method, let's move this aside. Okay, now if I do a control space, I see that there are two query.setIntegers. One, it takes an integer as the first argument, and the second method that takes a string as the first argument. So this is what we need to look at now. The first method is a positional placeholder substitution where you specify the position, which is an integer. The second method is the named placeholder substitution where you have to specify the name. So this is a string. So what I'll do is I'll use this option. Now the name will be user ID. So I need to give user ID as a string. And of course the second argument will be the same. It will be the value itself. So I'm going to substitute that here. Okay, in the same way, the query.setString has to take this name as the first argument as a string. So I will pass username as the first argument. So again, what we're doing here is, instead of putting a question mark and then assigning parameters based on the position of the question mark, we are putting placeholders with names and then we are assigning arguments, parameters to those names in the placeholders. So let me save and run this. There you go. The user shows up because the query is run fine. So these are the two ways in which we can do parameter substitution, and it is highly recommended that we use parameter substitution for any queries with parameters instead of just appending parameters, because appending parameters might lead to SQL injection attacks. So this is a safer way to add parameters to your queries.